Lycera Prime wore celebration like armor. The grand hall was a cathedral of light and sound, its vaulting ribs alive with bioluminescent veins that brightened and dimmed according to the pulse of the orchestra. Crystal chandeliers shaped like unfurled wings hovered in stately orbits, throwing constellations across lacquered floors where 100 noble houses rippled in fabrics that changed color with the room's mood. Servants flowed along predetermined currents, silver trays steady as planets, smiles practiced to the point of invisibility. On the raised dais, Empress Seraphine sat perfectly still within her throne of living glass, a throne that breathed, faintly, the way a sleeping creature does. It adjusted to her posture before she thought to shift, kept the ache from her spine, cooled the constant low fever grief had left behind. Her crown was a filament of diamond fire. Her eyes were harder. Every movement in the hall sent her a report. Which minister would betray her for prestige? Which house bartered loyalty in exchange for old grudges scrubbed from public record? Which distant world needed grain? Which nearer one required mercy that would be called weakness tomorrow? She catalogued, weighed, judged. There was no room left in her for anything small. Beside her hovered Princess Aelira's grav chair, humming softly to compensate for the hall's variable gravity. The chair's casing was a miracle of Lycaran design, sleek, pearl-bright, able to follow a breath or hold steady against a gale. It made no sound when it rose or turned. The mechanical legs folded beneath Aelira's silver gown were not miracles. They were compromises. The accident had taken bone and nerve and a father. It had left the Empress a child who could no longer run, and a dynasty that would not be allowed to forget how economies of power punish softness. They called Aelira the broken air when they thought the microphones were hungry and not listening. Seraphine heard the phrase, bounce off marble, and swallow itself in silk. She tightened her jaw until the impulse to destroy something passed. And she looked down at her daughter's hands instead, small and clever, tapping rhythms the orchestra didn't know how to play, thumb worrying at a thread. Those hands had once learned to braid her own hair, because the Empress had been called away too often to teach her. A fanfare unfurled, ceremonial as sunrise, and the court slid into place as if greased. 100 courtiers arranged their faces into admiration and their bodies into geometry. Dancers in opaline masks drifted onto the floor, feathers sighing at their ankles. The first waltz rose in luxurious arcs, designed for long limbs and perfect balance, for couples bred to turn without thinking or colliding. The hall's light sensed that, and brightened to flatter them. No one asked the princess to dance. The space around her chair, at the foot of the dais, remained as clear as an accusation. Seraphine leaned, a fraction toward Aelira, as the second waltz began. The kind with a swelling center that always made her think of tidewater. "We can retire early," she said, her voice light enough to pass as an option. "The gardener says the night blossoms open today." Aelira kept her eyes on the dancers. The grav chair tilted, almost imperceptibly, toward the music. "I like the sound the floor makes," she murmured. Her smile was practiced. Her knuckles were white. The Empress laid a hand on her daughter's shoulder and felt the electrical buzz of the chair through the silk. She had commissioned 1,000 protocols to build a world where Aelira would never need to feel lesser. And yet here, in a room that worshipped beauty, the most beautiful thing sat in place while everyone else rehearsed admiration for one another. A ripple passed through the servants' current. A human waiter stepped out of it, wrong-footing the choreography. He wore the black vest and white shirt of his trade, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a linen towel tucked into his waistband like a banner pretending not to be one. He had the unremarkable look of men you forget until they are needed. Sun-browned skin, dark hair, pushed behind one ear. The determined calm of someone who has learned the measure of his own usefulness and refused embarrassment for it. He crossed the edge of the dance floor with the soft-footed confidence of a person who has carried too much and never dropped it. The hall noticed, because it had been built to notice everything. Guards along the pillars shifted their weight, the way storms shift when geography surprises them. The orchestra's conductor glanced up, startled, and missed a beat before recovering it with a flourish. The human stopped 3 paces from the grav chair and bowed toward the princess as if she were the center of gravity and not the dais behind her. Not the shallow dip one uses for royalty at a distance. Not the comic court bow sometimes deployed by servants hoping to be invisible through ridiculousness. He folded at the waist, hand to heart, and stayed there long enough to make a point without making a scene. The Empress's palm tightened against the throne's arm. Protocols flashed in the air before her, translucent and insistent. All the ways this would be interpreted as insolence. All the punishments that would be demanded for his audacity. She lifted her eyes to the guard captain and saw him already moving to intercept. "Stop," she said, barely above breath. The air carried it anyway. The guards froze with discipline that had cost her 2 budget wars and a decade of patience. Alira stared at the human as if a door had opened in the floor and revealed not a pit, but a garden. Her lips parted, her hands stilled in her lap. The grav chair hummed at a slightly higher pitch, registering the change in her breathing. "Your Highness," the man said, his voice low, careful, musical in a way that belonged to kitchens at midnight and street corners where lovers keep promises. "May I borrow your rhythm?" Nothing in the court's extensive laws covered that question. It came from a realm no one had thought to legislate. The Empress felt the room lean forward, and with it the centuries of Lissaran correctness. Alira's gaze flicked to her mother. A small child's reflex tucked inside a woman's composure. Seraphine should have nodded to a guard. She should have let the machine of etiquette grind this interruption to sand. She found herself inclining her head instead, almost imperceptibly, and realized the decision had made itself without consulting her throne. Arin Vale didn't touch the grav chair. He turned his palm upward, an invitation with no weight behind it, and waited while the princess lifted her hand. Her fingers hovered, unsure, then slid into his. Up close, she could see his hands weren't palace hands. There were faint scars along the knuckles, old cuts from hard glass, a thin burn along the wrist where a pan had fought him and lost. They were steady now, warmed by the nearness of her pulse. "I can't stand," Alira whispered. The apology, reflexive and cruel. "We aren't going to," he said. "You lead. I'll keep time." He took 1 step backward, guiding her arm into a curve that matched the measure of the music. The grav chair responded to the angle of her shoulder and the pressure of her palm, gliding an inch, then 2. The chair had been designed for obedience. It learned grace on the move. Arin ran his free hand down the air beside it, coaxing the sensors to treat that motion as a cue rather than a command. The chair pivoted a quarter turn. The hem of Alira's gown whispered against the floor. The room inhaled. This was not a dance of feet. It was a dance of breath and correspondence. Arin matched his spine to the chair's micro-adjustments. Let his center follow the machine's minute shifts until his body found the same language it used to carry trays through impossible crowds. Alira turned her wrist, and he translated it into a shallow arc. She angled her elbow, and he spun her with the mildest flourish, not daring the extravagance of a full turn yet, letting her confidence catch up to her desire. The orchestra, sensing an event it couldn't name, softened by a hair, then by a breath, then found itself accompanying, rather than dictating. The conductor's baton slowed a fraction, and a ribbon of strings spilled like water around them. The floor, wired to the hall's sound field, answered with patterns of light that unfurled beneath the chair's path. Gold spirals when they curved, pale rose when Alira laughed, sudden constellations when the grav unit lifted her a handspan and set her down as if the world were a tide and she its moon. At the dais, Seraphine's fingers curled in on themselves until her nails bit her palm. The crook of her daughter's elbow, the tilt of her chin, the shape of her mouth, as it forgot its practiced distance, these stabbed her through armor she had welded plating over. She had instructed surgeons, signed requisitions, audited the funding of rehabilitation programs until the numbers ran clean and unforgiving. She had imagined, in the midnight hours, the movement she had taken from her child and given to stability. None of it had prepared her for the sight of her daughter turning toward joy like a plant toward light, held steady by a stranger's regard. Around the floor, outrage bloomed in hushed color. "Indecent," hissed a noble with a latticework jaw. "Human theatrics," murmured a minister, whose vote had once cost the Empress a boarder. "He'll want a medal," someone else said, with a laugh that did not open its teeth. Seraphine heard all of it, as she always did. The guard captain's eyes sought hers again. She lifted a hand without looking away from the dancers, the smallest motion that meant hold. Aaron had stopped seeing the court as, soon as the princess took his hand, the way her shoulders settled as her chair learned his rhythm told him everything. He tried a deeper turn, his wrist an arc across the air. The chair translated it into a slow spin. Alira's gown opening like a dropped veil around the radius of her joy. He stepped in, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him, leaned back. It was not a leading and a following. It was a conversation she had been waiting years to finish. She laughed, then the sound, thin at first, rusted at the edges, then brightening into something that made the chandeliers sharpen their attention. The floor caught the note and scattered it as violet light across their path. Aaron smiled without meaning to. Nodded once, as if they had solved a small, stubborn problem together, and shifted his weight in a way that turned their slow orbit into a glide. The grav chair floated past silk and armor, and faces suddenly humanized by surprise. Alira reached with her free hand, palm open, and let the lights tickle her fingertips as they changed color. "Look at the stones," she breathed, forgetting microphones and microphones forgetting to listen to anything else. "They're following us." "They're jealous," he said, as if the floor itself might be persuaded to try harder. He felt the tremor in her fingers when the chair lifted an inch too much. He compensated, dipping in toward her with his shoulder, so she could see his face rather than the expanse of the room. "We can stop at any time," he murmured. "No." She blinked tears away and laughed at them when they fell anyway. "Not when it finally feels like moving and not like being moved." He understood, because he had watched his sister learn to walk again with a brace and a wall, and a man who refused to call her brave for doing something she had no choice about. He understood because there is a rhythm a person has alone, and a rhythm the world tries to impose, and the only thing that can reconcile them is someone willing to stand in the space between and translate without stealing. "Again?" he asked. "Again," she said. They found the measure faster this time, having trained the sensors to accept the grammar of her wrist rather than the algorithm of caution. The spin broadened. Alira's hair lifted and fell, caught in the slipstream of her own movement. A circle opened in the crowd, because the room, even when stubborn, knew awe when it saw it. The courtiers moved back on instinct, their bodies making a halo she had earned. On the dais, something in Seraphine broke and arranged itself into a softer configuration. She had been the kind of sovereign who believed in correctness, because it never failed, not the state, at least. But here, in the mortifying light of her own hall, a human servant had committed the only treason she could not punish. He had made her want the thing she could not legislate for her child. The guard captain lowered his hand to his side, in a gesture almost like relief. The court, seeing where power pointed, began the long process of rewriting scandal into sentiment. The music faltered on the brink of crescendo, then remembered itself and cascaded down into a diminuendo, so gentle it seemed to apologize for leaving. Aaron used the last bars to guide the grav chair into a final arc that laid Alira back toward the throne without breaking the spell. He released her hand, as if putting something fragile on a shelf. She floated the last inch to stillness, and then, because rituals sometimes occur without kings, she reached for him. He bowed again. Simpler this time. Not to royalty but to a person who had given him more trust than the room deserved. "Thank you," she said, breathless, incandescent, the microphones present but irrelevant, "for reminding me I can still move." He shook his head once, the smallest denial, the most honest compliment. "You were always moving," he said. "I just matched you." The chandeliers dimmed of their own accord, the hall's living light lowering to let the shape of what had happened hold without glare. Somewhere behind the pillars, a minor official began to draft a condemnation, and halfway through his second sentence, found he couldn't make the words stick to the page. The Empress Seraphine stood before she realized she had moved, hand pressed to the place her armor had used to be. The fact of her daughter's joy would change nothing in the budget, everything in the room, and more than that later, when the room's echo finally reached the law. For now, she did the least imperial, most impossible thing she could do. She let her heart be visible on her face, and did not order it away. Applause arrived late, as if sound itself had needed to collect its courage. It began in uncertain clicks of glass on glass, then found palms, then swelled into a roar that tried to disguise how long it had hesitated. The chandeliers dimmed a fraction, protective of the girl at the center of the praise. The living floor let its auroras fade to a low glow, like coals deciding to be gentle. Alira sat radiant in the afterlight, hair caught with static, cheeks wet with the evidence of a feeling the court's language did not accommodate. Aaron stepped back the way a tide recedes without fuss, without claiming credit for the shoreline. He made himself smaller in the space between songs and servers, already reaching for a fallen glass to keep some other accident from stealing the room. A courtier in ivy-green silk slid in his path with a smile that had been sharpened for years. "Bold," the man said, a compliment phrased like a charge. "We reward audacity differently on Lysara, human." Aaron's answer was the wrong kind for politics and the right kind for kitchens. "I was asked," he said simply, as if the word contained the whole physics of consent. He stooped to retrieve the glass. The courtier's hand went out not to help, but to forbid. "Leave him." The Empress's voice wasn't raised, and it carried farther than the music had. The courtier's hand retreated, as if from heat. Seraphine stood because the room would not be safe until she did. The throne loosened its hold on her spine. The Empress crossed the dais with the measured step of a woman who has learned that speed looks like desperation in men's minutes. From arm's length she smelled ionized frost from the grav chair, and the faint trace of jasmine from Alira's hair. She could not smell the powder of crushed stone and burning metal that had lived in her lungs since the day the shuttle tore itself open and remade both their lives. For a moment the memory overlapped the present, the scream of rending hull, her husband's hand slipping out of hers, the impossibly small weight of Alira in her arms. Then the hall returned, crystal and silk, and the terrible, ordinary sound of celebration, trying to behave. "What is your name?" she asked the man, who had unstitched a century of etiquette with the touch of a hand. He straightened and bowed like a craftsman, acknowledging a client. "Aaron Vale, Majesty." "Who taught you to do that?" He glanced at Alira, as if checking that she wanted the explanation, then back. "Rooms did," he said. "Crowded ones that punish elbows. And an older sister who refused to let a mining brace decide how small her world would be. I learned to follow without dragging and lead without taking." The sentence grazed a seam in Seraphine she had sealed over with policy. She felt it give, a breath's worth, and the shock of that nearly broke her composure. The court was watching, hungry, adoring, calculating. She could use this, her advisors would say later, spin it into mercy. Monetize compassion. She did not know yet if she had the will to ruin a good thing by making it useful. Alira's fingers flexed on the arm of her chair. "Mother," she said, voice unsteady. May we try again later? When it's quiet?" Seraphine turned her head to her daughter. So slowly, the motion felt like learning a new gravity. The girl's pupils were blown wide with adrenaline. Her lips had already returned to their neat, practiced line as if apologizing for joy. There would be whispers about exploitation, about theater. There would be accusations about human presumption and imperial laxity. There would be functions to smooth and statements to release, and 1,000 little deaths of the moment before it could be born into law. Yes, Seraphine said, deciding publicly and privately at once. When it's quiet. The guard captain, reading tides, released the pressure of the room with 3 gestures that looked like nothing. Music returned. This time a piece chosen for its refusal to intrude. The courtiers resumed motion as if they'd always intended to do so. Their dignity rearranged so quickly it might have been choreography. Aaron slid back into the current of service, picking up a tray as if he had never set it down, losing his outline in a sea of polished sleeves and efficient hands. Seraphine returned to the dais not because the moment was over, but because it needed to be claimed in a place that knew how to record precedent. The throne accepted her weight and did not presume to comfort. Alira reached for her mother's fingers. Seraphine didn't flinch from the electricity of the grav chair this time. She closed over her daughter's hand and let the residual tremor of adrenaline travel up her arm. It felt like a pulse she recognized from another life. A boy usher in a tunic too stiff for breathing ran the length of the hall to the dais and stopped himself 2 paces short with a squeak of shoe on marble. "Majesty," he whispered, terrified of being noticed and failing spectacularly. "The night blossoms have opened, as you predicted." Seraphine looked down at Alira, at the wet lashes and the stubborn mouth and the fragile, indestructible light occupying her daughter's face. "Then we'll go see them," she said, "and we will invite the man who thinks to ask before he takes." The court learned a new word for the event that night. They would later call it a breach, a scandal, a turning. In the Empress's memory, it would be simply the first moment she chose her child over the room and discovered the empire did not end, only its weather did. The palace gardens floated on a platform tethered to the palace like a tethered moon, far enough from the city to steal its stars, near enough to hold its breath. Night-blooming vines spilled from trellises, their petals releasing light in pulses that matched the beat of some hidden hive. The air tasted of wet stone and clean earth. Seraphine had meant it as a private place for decisions too delicate for microphones. Tonight, it felt like the only room that could hold whatever she was about to risk. Aaron arrived, escorted and unescorted all at once, 2 guards at his back who had practiced being invisible, and a posture that made their presence unnecessary. He stopped under the arch of a flowering bough and bowed, not to the crown, but to the woman whose hands were empty for the first time in public in a decade. "Majesty." "Aaron Vale," Seraphine said, testing the shape of his name against the night. "Did you know what you were doing?" "Yes," he said. "And no." He lifted his eyes. "I knew I wanted her to have the choice every other body in that room was given without thinking. I didn't know it would ask so much of you." Something in her face, some wire that had been drawn taut since the accident uncoiled a millimeter. She heard in his answer the absence of the 2 things she despised most in her court: pity and calculation. "You've humiliated my court," she said, because she needed to speak aloud the thing the day would say back to her. "Tomorrow." "I might have embarrassed their customs," he said. "I meant to remind them of their manners." She should have found the line rehearsed. It didn't land that way. It landed like a man describing a task. A gust of cool air threaded the vines. Somewhere a nightbird practiced a descending scale and, deciding it would do, stopped. A gravel-soft hum approached. Alira came into the pool of the lantern's light, her grav chair set low enough that the leaves brushed her hair. She wore the same gown she had insisted, but her shoulders had let go of their armor and discovered a new occupation: anticipation. For a moment she hesitated at the edge of the stone path, as if this, too, were a dance floor that could deny her if it chose to. Then she rolled forward until she could see both of them and the blossoms beyond, petals breathing light like a heartbeat. Aaron didn't go to her until she had come to him. He stopped a hand's breadth from the chair and made his palm, the same invitation he had made in front of the galaxy. "May I borrow it again?" he asked. The pronoun was different this time. He had changed it from you to it. He meant rhythm. He meant the part of the world that seizes when someone else decides for you and loosens when someone decides with you. Elira set her hand in his. The chair rose a thumb width, enough to keep from clipping root or stone, and turned. Here, with the orchestra replaced by the rustle of leaves and the steady song of the city below, the motion felt less like defiance and more like prayer. Aaron matched his step to the chair's breathing and then, daring gently, shifted his weight to suggest a wider curve. The vines answered, with a soft rain of pollen light. Elira's mouth shaped an O of child delight that no tutor had managed to train out of her. Seraphine watched and realized that the fear she had leaned on for years, fear of weakness, of talking points sharpening into knives, of giving her enemies a K, the story they could weaponize had been a poor steward. It had guarded her throne. It had not guarded her daughter. The recognition stung, like the first wash of antiseptic. "Stop," she said. And they did. Immediately. Not startled. Only attentive. She stepped forward until flowers brushed her crown. The guards in the shadows pretended to study the night. "You understand this cannot become a spectacle," she said to Aaron. "The court will devour her joy and call it admiration." "I understand," he said. "You can keep cameras away. I can keep myself ordinary." He rubbed his thumb absently along a small scar on his wrist. "But you cannot keep her from needing to move." Elira's chin lifted with that stubborn tilt Seraphine had loved in her since she'd been a toddler practicing sovereignty over a spoon. "I am tired of being perfectly still," she said. "I would like to be imperfectly alive." It was unfair to be outnumbered by your own child and a waiter. It was also, Seraphine knew, the fairest thing the night had offered her in a decade. She exhaled, and the garden seemed to like her better for it. "Tell me what you did," she said to Aaron, choosing specifics because specifics are how you build instructions sturdy enough to survive politics. "Technically, I want to know what to order my engineers never to forbid again." Aaron glanced at the chair's control seam. "These grav units are calibrated against abrupt acceleration," he said. "They damp spurious inputs. The chair reads intention mostly in the shoulders and wrists, subtle shifts in load. Your designers set the threshold high to protect." I lowered it with my hand. Not a hack. An invitation. It learned her patterns the way a tray learns a waiter's balance. She spoke to it. I translated. Seraphine touched the casing, as if it might bite. It was warm from Elira's body heat and the chair's quiet work. She slid her hand along the seam, the way Aaron had, palm, showing. The chair interpreted the gesture as commentary, not command. Elira, grinning, leaned a fraction, and the machine obeyed her. Not the Empress. "Good," Seraphine thought, a little savagely. "Good. Where did you learn to listen like that?" she asked, and regretted it when her voice betrayed the curiosity she had schooled out of her public tone. He tilted his head, searching for the shortest honest answer. "On a planet that rains too hard for shouting," he said, "in a diner with 16 tables and 7 regulars who only liked one booth. Carrying a pot of soup that burned if I hurried, and disappointed if I was late." He smiled, remembering something that belonged only to him, and from Mara. After the collapse they fitted her with a brace and a patience we hadn't saved up. We taught each other the difference between helping and taking over. Mara. A name like a ford across a river. Seraphine filed it without the guilt that used to accompany learning about a servant's life. "If I ask you to remain in the palace for a time," she said, returning to the bureaucracy because it was a language she could use to protect them all. "It will be as an employee, not as a symbol. The court will try to turn you into a story. I think you would be bad at that." "I hope so," he said. "I'm very good at shoes that don't squeak and doors that close quietly. I can also teach your staff how not to make joy into a performance." The corner of her mouth twitched, and for a dangerous heartbeat, the Empress remembered being a girl who had flirted with boys in markets, just to prove she was still a person beneath her mother's crown. You presume much, Arenvale. I presume breakfast at the staff canteen and a roof that doesn't leak, he said. The rest is your jurisdiction. Alira startled them both by catching her mother's hand, and Aaron's in the same motion. A bridge of fingers across an abyss. None of them had language, for yet. May I keep practicing with him? She asked, as if asking to keep a stray animal. In the mornings, before the tutors come. Seraphine looked at their joined hands, at the scars on his, at the tremor in her daughter's knuckles, at the luminous dust from the blossoms marking all three of them as present at the same hour. She thought of her counsel, of their sharpened mouths. She thought of the small ledger she kept, the one no one else had ever seen, where she wrote in childish script the things she would pay anything for the empire to keep. Safe bridges, fair prices, lullabies that moved through walls unimpeded, her daughter's laugh unmonetized. Yes, she said, in the mornings. And you will teach my engineers what you taught this chair. If they argue, I will let you embarrass them. Aaron bowed his head with the seriousness due a sacred charge. I prefer to make friends of engineers, he said. They fix the things that fix other things. From somewhere back in the hedges, a guard smothered a cough that might have been a laugh. The nightbird tried another scale and improved it. Alira drew the chair into a small turn, facing the blossoms. She examined the way their light came and went and, following some private theory, turned her wrist. The petals brightened. She beamed at her own cleverness, and then at Aaron, as if to say, again, again, again. Seraphine stood with them until the cold found her bones, until the lanterns had burned halfway down, and the palace below had switched off the lights in rooms where no one was working. She dismissed the guards and walked back alone, carrying under her skin the dangerous sensation of having done the right thing too late for the past, and just in time for the future. When she reached her chambers, she found herself not at her desk, not at the balcony, but at the low shelf beside her bed, where a single object sat under a square of glass. A child's wind-up toy, damaged in the crash and repaired badly by hands that had shaken too hard with grief. She lifted the cover and wound the key. The toy lurched forward on crooked legs, determined. It made it halfway across the table before tipping over and laughing in a tinny chime it had not been designed to produce. Seraphine laughed back, quietly, scandalously alone. In the morning, the court would call for punishments and protocols. In the morning, she would be Empress again. Tonight, she let the sound have her. And through the open window, the garden's night blossoms breathed their slow, brave light in time with the pulse of a girl who had danced sitting down and made the world stand up to watch. Dawn in the palace did not arrive with trumpets. It came in the hush that falls when staff change shifts, in the click of dew condensing along the greenhouse ribs, in the soft electric exhale of machines that had kept other people's dreams level through the night. In that hour, before the court remembered what it disliked, Alira practiced moving. Aaron placed his hand beneath hers and did not lift. He showed her which muscles the chair listened to. The sliver of shoulder at the base of the neck, the fine swing of the wrist, the quiet at the elbow that decides whether a turn is a plea or a promise. He taped 3 tiny felt dots to her fingertips, white, white, blue. When you want to change directions, he said. Let the blue brush the air, not the armrest. The chair needs to see the wind you mean to make. It's listening? She asked, skeptical and secretly pleased. It is, if we teach it to, he said. He held up his hand. She mirrored it. The chair drifted a fraction, and, to both their surprise, purred. They did not use music at first. He counted under his breath 1 to 3, 2 to 4 faster than a lullaby, slower than court waltzes, the tempo of kitchen doorways and market crowds. When she faltered, he did not murmur comfort. He corrected the way a good partner does. Tiny, exact. Enough to keep momentum from collapsing into apology. The chair learned faster than the engineers had predicted. So did Alira. She no longer flinched when the gravity caught and released. She no longer fought the lift. She learned when to ask, and when to let the machine try. Above them, 3 floors up and behind a curtain that pretended to be fronds, Seraphine watched with her hands around a ceramic mug gone cool. No attendants, no scribe, no security briefings pushed ahead of their time. She had told no one she would be here because she did not trust her own face yet. Something about the way the girl and the waiter made space for each other loosened a knot the throne had taught her to treat as a virtue. She could see her daughter's jaw unclench. She could hear something new in the room. Effort without fear. By second bell, engineers arrived with their clipboards and clean shoes. They had spent the night arguing in the language of graphs and safety margins, then writing their argument into code anyway. Master Orlan, who had calibrated grav plinths since before the Empress had inherited a single counselor, carried the suspicion of men who have watched fashion injure people and been asked to applaud. He stood at the edge of the floor and cleared his throat in a way that was not a challenge, only a declaration. We are here now. Teach us, or be quiet. Aaron did not perform. He showed them the seam where the chair reads intention. He pointed out the line of code that treated tremor as noise instead of signal. He asked what threshold they set for braking, and what threshold they set for trust, and why those numbers were the same. Orlan bristled, then listened, then asked a question so exact it cut his own pride to make room for the answer. The youngest engineer, hair still wet from a hurried wash, said, almost apologetic, "We were told to design for prevention. We forgot to design for desire." "Then add desire," Aaron said, as if ordering a part. They wrote a protocol before breakfast ended. It was inelegant and right. They called it conversational input, because engineers can be romantic when no one is watching. Orlan signed the testing order with a pen he had used to ground suits on docking belts during sandstorms. "If anyone asks, this was my idea," he said. Deadpan. "I am too old to argue with people who don't sweat." Aaron grinned. Alira, emboldened, tried a small spin she hadn't attempted yet. The chair answered with a flourish as if showing off to impress the stern man with the pen. The court, which metabolized rumor faster than sugar, watched all of this through distorting glass. By midday, a story had braided itself around the reality. The human had bewitched the princess. The Empress had been moved to tears in front of her own guards. The engineers were taking orders from a man whose qualifications involved carrying soup. The words human and waiter were used as if they canceled each other out. The High Consul requested a meeting and arrived with a patience that smelled like bait. "Majesty," he said in the throne room, the honorific pronounced as if it were his to lend. "Traditions are anchors." The people looked to the palace for steadiness. A spectacle of pity befitting a street festival does not honor your line. Seraphine felt her jaw go heavy. She had hired the consul because he believed in numbers the way she did. She had tolerated him because his contempt fell in the right direction more often than not. She had not noticed how thoroughly he had confused cruelty with discernment. "A spectacle of pity?" she repeated softly. "I saw Joy perform a rescue in my hall, and no one paid admission." He did not flinch. "You risk weakening the imperial image." "Perhaps the image can carry its own weight for one night," she said. She almost smiled. It was not the Empress's smile. The consul's pupils tightened, realizing too late that he had misread the room. "This is not a debate," she added, and let him go on a long errand to talk himself out of a future. The errand included whispers to House Vaucour, whose sons had trained their bodies into militancy, and to the Guild of Kinetic Arts, which had built an entire philosophy around symmetry as proof of moral worth. It included a proposal for a demonstration that would prove the court's point without making them say it. A public waltz, to honor the founders with the floor's grav field, set to traditional thresholds, chairs excluded by a reading of the safety statute that most people had forgotten existed because it had only ever been used to bar the wrong kind of musicians. If the Empress refused, they would call her sentimental. If she accepted, they would say the human had failed under fair conditions. If the girl insisted on attending anyway, the field would buck her out of the story. When the invitation reached Seraphine, delivered in a file whose language wore the smug humility of law, she recognized the trap, and, for the first time since her husband's death, smiled in public in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She looked down at the greenhouse 3 floors below, where her daughter was laughing because the chair had just learned to answer a gesture that wasn't in any manual. She thought of Orland's pen, of the tape on Alira's fingertips, of Aaron's hands hovering over the seam without trespass. "Accept," she said, and every minister in the room leaned forward too hard and nearly fell out of his chair. And triple the audience. They called it the Founder's Waltz, to make it sound inevitable. The Hall of Banners, a long, stern room draped in centuries, filled with people who had come to be reassured that the future would look like the past but more flattering. The Grav floor's field shimmered invisible and sure. The orchestra sat ready, faces composed into the expression that means we will play precisely what is asked, and also what is needed if the two are not the same. Seraphine did not dress for battle. She dressed for clarity. The crown was a line of light. The gown moved when she did, and not on its own. Alira entered on time. Not early enough to appear desperate. Not late enough to be graciously dissuaded at the door. The murmurs were soft and sharp. Aaron walked at her left, not in front, not behind, in the place where help can be summoned without shame. Orland took a position at the control console and folded his hands so no one would notice how white his knuckles were. "By tradition," the High Consul announced, voice carrying with the smug ease of a man who believes acoustics are on his side, "the field is set to ensure the safety of unaided bodies traversing the floor. Devices with their own motive forces are invited to observe." Alira's fingers tightened on the chair. Aaron bent and said for her ears only, "We will not wrestle it. We will make the room come to us." Alira lets the people. And then a thing happened that would later be written as strategy, and was, in the moment, instinct. The Empress stood and left the dais before anyone could stop her. She descended the steps one by one, not slow enough to look staged, not fast enough to look reckless, and took her place beside her daughter. The microphones in the room reached for her and she ignored them with the courtesy she reserved for insects. "If the field excludes my heir," she said, only to Alira, which in that room meant to everyone, "it excludes me." The consul flinched like a man surprised by his own reflection. Orland's mouth tilted. Aaron looked at the floor and saw, with the unerring gaze of a person who spends his life not dropping things, the places where it would let them through, and the places where it would not. "All right," he said softly. "To the chair, to the floor, to the orchestra, to whatever God listens in rooms like these. We change the steps." He raised Alira's hand, and did not step onto the field. He guided her along the edge, where the Grav plane's slope was lazy and would not fight if you were polite. He used the columns as landmarks and made the waltz into a promenade, a set of pivot points pinned to stone. At each turn he let Alira pause a breath longer than the music wanted, because the floor would punish hurry. He counted out loud, not in courtly meter now, but in the rhythm of breath draw. Hold. Give. The orchestra, under a conductor who remembered theater after the revolution and how to lie on behalf of mercy, adjusted a hair at a time until their waltz matched a physiology the hall had not considered noble. A wave of confusion rolled across the room and broke without foam. The dance was wrong, and it was beautiful. Those who had come to be outraged found their outrage having to choose between music and malice. Malice rarely keeps time well. The consul lifted a finger toward the control bank. "Increase the field," he ordered. A technician whose paycheck feared and resented him in equal measure. Orland did not look at the man. He said, softly, Touch that console without my order, and I will retire into your office and live there." The technician withdrew his hand as if instructed by a parent. It could have ended there, with a waltz that refused to be pinned to geometry by a machine that had mistaken caution for law. But sabotage is stubborn, a failsafe buried in old code, set to a founder's day. The palace had always observed, without noticing what it was observing. Woke like a grudge. A line on Orlan's panel spiked. The grav plane flexed, for a heartbeat. The floor turned treacherous. Alira's chair lifted and yawed. The wheel brushed a field edge and bit. The audience inhaled as one body that had never learned first aid. Aaron's hands moved faster than thought. He did not grab. He pressed along the seam, not to command, but to remind. "Here," he said, low, to the chair, to the girl, to the floor. "You know her weight. Remember." The chair shuddered, remembered, and leveled. The moment, which had been a single bead of sweat rolling too slowly down 1,000 backs, broke and ran into history where it could no longer do harm. The consul attempted a smile that had been cultivated for disasters he could claim credit for surviving. "We see," he began, and Seraphine, who had learned when to wield silence and when to break it, stepped onto the field. Microphones begged for it. Cameras found angles that would flatter at the expense of truth. She ignored both and addressed the consul. "Master Orlan," she said, and the man stood straighter than he had at any inspection. "Widen the threshold, permanently, across the palace, across the city, across the worlds under our flag. If a room listens only to perfection, it is unfit for citizens." Orlan did not salute. He did not need to. "Aye, Majesty," he said, and entered the order in a sequence that, written down, would look like numbers, but in reality was a man bringing an empire's machines into the present tense. The floor's tone softened, almost sheepish. The waltz found its earlier measure again, but something had changed. The field was no longer a wall. It was wind, sometimes adverse, often helpful, always honest. Aaron guided Alira through the middle of the hall, the place reserved for winners. She lifted her chin and did not hide the remnants of fear on her face. The audience, trained for centuries to worship polish, saw bravery look like function instead of ornament, and discovered their bodies wanted to cheer for it. The Empress did not raise a proclamation then. She did something worse for her enemies, and better for everyone else. She turned to the nearest camera and spoke as if it were a person. "From this day," she said, and her voice was not loud, only unable to be ignored, "the doctrine of form is dissolved. Beauty is no longer a requirement for dignity. The right to, motion-assisted, invented, improvised, will be codified as law. Engineers will be charged not with preventing difficulty, but with expanding agency. The palace will be first to comply, and the court will be audited in public. I name Aaron Vale to the post of Companion of Kinetics." She paused, as if amused by her own matchmaking of words, "to advise where rooms are cruel and to teach where rooms can be kind." The consul opened his mouth. She did not look at him. "High Consul," she added, still to the camera, "you will carry the bill to the council chamber tonight. If your feet cannot find their way, borrow the floor's new grace." Laughter rippled, not derisive, not nervous. Delighted. Dangerous. Someone began to clap and, freed from the obligation to approve before they felt, others followed. The applause lifted and held. The orchestra, who had taken the measure of the moment as expertly as any courtier, resolved the waltz with a flourish that would play well, on news loops without turning the scene into a cartoon. Alira turned in her chair, not toward the dais, and not toward the camera, but to her mother. She extended her hand, the one with the blue felt dot, and the Empress took it and bowed not to a subject, not even to a daughter, but to a partner who had taught her a step she had not known she could learn. When the hall emptied and the banners remembered how to hang, Seraphine found Aaron in the corridor where the air tasted ordinary, and that was a relief. He had removed his vest, rolled his sleeves, and leaned against a column with the posture of a man who had added one more impossible shift to the end of his week, and suddenly found himself with no plates left to carry. "Companion of kinetics," he said, as if trying on a pair of boots that fit better than expected. "What does that mean in your language?" "Get there early," she said. "Leave late. Tell me the truth, before it embarrasses us. Drink water. Keep the mornings." He looked up, surprised, as if she had reached across something she wasn't supposed to pass. "Keep the mornings? They belong to you. And to her," she said. "If the court wants them, they can petition the chair." He smiled, and she envied for a moment the ease with which people who are not sovereign can show their teeth. "Then I will spend them wisely." Seraphine nodded, and let herself say the sentence she had been saving for an empire that might never deserve it. "Thank you," she said, "for borrowing our rhythm and returning it in one piece." "Not in one," he said, glancing back toward the empty hall, where the new field hummed, as if trying to memorize their shapes. "In many. That's the point." He left her there a moment, leaning into the ordinary stone, listening to a building take a new breath. When she went back to her chambers, the night blossoms were still open, slow lighting the glass with the patient pulse of living things. She unpinned her crown and set it down beside the toy with crooked legs, and for the first time since the crash, she slept without waking to check whether the world would let her child move in the morning. Applause is a weather pattern. It blows through and leaves a place brighter than it was, but it does not rewire the pipes. The days after the Founders' Waltz were made of pipes. The decree moved out into the city first as rumor, then as memo, then as orders with signatures so clear the ink looked still wet. Gravitic fields were recalibrated from banks to bakeries. Railings sprouted along ceremonial stairs that had once existed to make people feel small. Elevators learned to kneel when a palm asked them to. Doors stopped, pretending to be tests of character. Aaron built a desk he never sat at. His office became a corridor everyone used as a shortcut, which was appropriate because shortcuts were what he taught. The path from intent to movement, without shame, added in the middle. He walked the palace with Orlan and a troop of young engineers whose ears were still loud with the thrill of having been told to fix the right thing for once. In a gallery lined with portraits of conquerors, he showed a guard how to quiet the echo so boot heels didn't drown out soft voices. In a training yard, he suggested the drill sergeant teach recruits how to brace a stranger discreetly when a tremor asks for honesty, and watch the sergeant blink, then nod, as if someone were finally permitting him to care the way he always had when no one was looking. Alira kept the mornings. They practiced under the greenhouse ribs while the night blossoms folded the last of their light away like a tide withdrawing. She learned to signal the chair with a tilt no one else would notice, to let it carry when pride wanted to push, to ignore the urge to overperform for microphones that weren't invited anyway. When she failed, she laughed, and the laugh had stopped being brittle. It had learned to call herself back instead of summoning pity. The High Consul did what men built on old scaffolding always do when the wind changes. He tried to keep his footing with vocabulary. He spoke of prudence and order, and the danger of letting sentiment write policy. He found himself assigned to oversee the first round of retrofits in the council wing. Seraphine had decided he should be very close to the new ramps as they marched up the marble. On the second day, crossing a newly gentled threshold with a stack of folders under his arm, he slipped. Aaron was there, because Aaron was everywhere, and caught the papers, not the man, keeping dignity intact as precisely as if it were a teacup on a tray. "You," the consul said, more startled than grateful, and then, because habits are heavy, "you are everywhere." "Rooms are," Aaron answered. "I'm just learning their names." Resistance did not vanish. It learned new tactics. An arts guild proposed a performance in which dancers, tethered to weighted belts, would show the nobility of strain without aid. A minister floated a budget amendment that would cut funding to school exolabs in favor of a prestige bridge no one would use. A memo circulated arguing that inclusive design should phase in over 20 years so as not to disrupt the palace's aesthetic. Seraphine sent the memo back with a single note. Aesthetic is what we feel while something works. Then she signed an executive order, accelerating the timetable to 5. News from other worlds began to hum against the palace windows. A steward on Orith learned to adjust the gravrail so an elderly trader could step onto the ferry without pretending it didn't hurt. A refinery on Narx changed ladder rungs to steps and watched accidents plummet with the pride of someone who had always known better. On a farm moon whose name never made the bulletins, a girl built crutches that grew taller as she did because she was sick of buying the world in installments. The test that mattered did not announce itself with an invitation. It arrived at the edge of a storm, as they often do. Folded into an afternoon that had planned to be ordinary, a pressure front rolled off the western sea and made the city ring like wet glass. One of the old grav cores in the palace substructure shuddered under the combined weight of history and weather. Elevators stalled between floors. Doors that should have yielded hesitated. In the Hall of Banners, 100 guests turned their faces toward the exits in the collective stupidity of a herd. Orlan's voice went to all channels without bothering to be formal. Field fluctuation. We are not losing the grid. We are reminding it to be polite. He began the work of talking to machines made when the Empire had had more ambition than humility, switching the new thresholds manually, smoothing the surge. He did not have enough hands. Aaron was already moving. He found Alira in the colonnade outside the Fa library, cheeks bright with exertion and delight. She had just managed a 3-curve pattern that had eluded her all week and watched her face change as the air changed. The chair faltered as the old core tried a trick it would get away with only once. "What do we do?" she asked, heartbeat audible in the answer. "We lead," he said, "and then we get out of the way." They took the service passage down to the Hall of Banners, where the grav plane was beginning to behave like a mirror, showing a younger, worse version of itself. Aaron sent a hand signal along the line of guards. He didn't need to. They had learned it from mornings in the greenhouse. Make space with the body you have. Become a wall that moves. He stepped into the hall's mouth and raised his hands as if calming a spooked animal. 2 lines, he said, not loud. The hall heard him anyway. Anyway, center clear. Follow the blue. The blue did not exist until he asked for it. The living floor, which had learned new tricks in the past few weeks, breathed a ribbon of color up the middle of the room like a river asking to be crossed. People obeyed color faster than they obeyed instruction. Alira wheeled into the center of the ribbon, and the crowd parted without thinking, because crowds are not as cruel as committees. She led, not with choreography but with consequence, the chair floating steady enough to be trusted. Behind her, 3 musicians who had been playing through the tension laid down their instruments and kept time with claps. Their faces calm and ferociously practical. The hall took their beat into its body and moved in units of breath, draw, hold, give. At the far door a stair waited, 13 steps and a landing to a corridor whose grav strip had not yet learned to kneel. A woman in a dress that made walking look like a lie stood at the foot of it, calculating defeat. Alira reached her, turned the chair with a small flourish that made the woman smile despite herself, and parked at the base of the first step. Aaron knelt, palms up. "Permission," he said to the woman, then to Alira, and, absurdly, to the stair. The woman nodded. Aaron, 2 guards, and an elderly minister who had removed his sash the moment it cut the line of his helping hands, formed a team without introductions. They lifted the chair, a riser at a time, at Aaron's count. Alira kept her hands where everyone could see them. When she reached the landing, she turned and addressed the room not as a princess, but as someone who had just practiced what everyone else tries very hard to avoid needing. "We'll be fine," she said. "We have legs, Wheels, music, and a river, one at a time. It was so practical, it landed as courage. By the time the storm relented, the hall had emptied with less panic than some banquets end with on purpose. Orland's voice returned to public channel. "The Corps has been reminded," he said dryly. "Please trust it again cautiously. Some of us are very old." In the quiet that followed, Seraphine found Alira on the landing. Hands still poised, as if the stair itself were a partner who might ask for another turn. She kissed her daughter's temple in the undignified way of mothers who forget thrones. She looked at Aaron with a gratitude so unornamented it could not be mistaken for policy. "You could have ordered the room," she said. "You asked it." "It was built to obey," he answered. "I'd like it to remember how to listen." The bill reached the council that night with a title the clerks had enjoyed writing: Right to Motion and Quiet Technology Act. It passed because no counselor wanted to be caught on the wrong side of the footage of a princess directing an evacuation with a hand and a blue line. The High Consul voted aye with an expression that suggested he had begun the long, embarrassing journey toward usefulness. News feeds in 1,000 kitchens and stations and dormitories ran the same clip in a loop. Not the waltz this time, but a practical promenade under a temperamental ceiling. Palms up, mouths steady. A blue river the width of a wheelchair and a kindness. A sovereign who showed up before the optics were arranged. The messages that followed were nothing like the letters Seraphine was used to. They did not congratulate. They reported, "We changed the spacing on the shuttle grab bars. My mother can open the new gate. I went to the market without timing it to the guard's break. My son's exo doesn't trip the doors anymore. We danced at the Rengens to Miss Home." He led. I cried. "Thank you for writing a right. I didn't know I had." The court stopped saying disability, like a diagnosis you lock away in a wing of rooms scented like lemon and denial. They began to say it the way engineers say force. A reality you design for, not against. The palace musicians wrote a new suite for promenade and chair and hand. The title made no one wince. Waltz. For a room. That. Learned. Seraphine began carrying an unadorned cane when the weather leaned hard on her bones. She refused to pretend it was a scepter. When a courtier complimented the cane's beauty, she answered without slowing, "It's beautiful because it makes my life possible." The courtier learned a new expression, regrettably late. At the end of the week, the staff found a small placard bolted to the inside of the service entrance by hands that handled wrenches more than words. It read, "Knock. So the room can answer." Aaron left it there because it said in 6 words what he had been trying to teach with 30 meetings and a smile. The mornings continued, as they were meant to, and on one of them, before even the greenhouse fans had warmed to their work, Alira stood. It was not a miracle. It was a device whose existence was made possible by a dozen new contracts and 1,000 quiet hours at a bench, by Orland's careful signatures and a young engineer's impatience. The sleeves, locked along her thighs like armor that had anticipated softness. Aaron clipped the last connection, checked the voltage with the suspicious tenderness of a man who remembers when a toy had gone dark in a child's hands and had never forgiven the universe for it. "We don't aim at the door," he said. "We aim at the chair. The chair aims at the door. Everyone does their own job." Alira nodded. Seraphine, who had told herself she would not watch, watched. The chair hummed behind her like a friend who knows when to be quiet. Alira reached for the rail. She lifted, not with a flourish, but with the micro-adjustments of a body negotiating a treaty with itself. The braces amplified what she asked and refused what would hurt. She found her balance the way she had learned to find grace, by asking nicely and refusing to take no for an answer when yes was possible. She took one step. It was small and wrong by the court's old metrics. It was perfect by the ones that mattered. She took another. The chair shadowed her like a faithful tide. Arin cried without making sound. Seraphine made a sound that did not belong on a calendar, and did not care. Alira looked up at them after the third step and said, very seriously, "You're allowed to clap." As if reminding the Empire how to greet the beginning of something properly. They did, in that greenhouse. With the night blossoms still yawning and a toy with crooked legs laughing softly under a square of glass. And for once the applause was not weather. It was a promise, made by hands that would be needed again tomorrow. It held. Years adjust themselves around a day like that. The anniversary did not require invention. It found its own shape. On the first, a crowd gathered under the hall of banners with shoes that squeaked less and a willingness to stand in the back if a chair needed the front. On the second, 1,000 cities lit their floors with the blue line and evacuation had taught them to love. The council stopped calling it commemoration and started calling it rehearsal. Because learning to move together remained work. Arin aged into someone the palace relied on without realizing it. He was still a waiter when the kitchens were short. Still a fixer when a hinge sulked. Still companion of kinetics, when a planet requested advice on how to build a station that would greet a body without asking it to pass a test. He collected engineers, the way some men collect jokes. He told fewer jokes because the rooms had finally begun to make their own kind of laughter. The sound of a door opening when someone thought it wouldn't. The sigh of a stair learning to invite. Orlan retired with the authority to call things by their names, and with a chair of his own that knelt at the edge of the sea so he could harass the waves. He sent a note to the palace on his last day. Keep hiring people who talk about wind. The note lived on Seraphine's desk. For a year. Then on Arin's. Then on Alira's. The High Consul did not resign in disgrace. Transformation is slower and better than gossip believes. He learned to carry clipboards on his forearm like a bridge for someone else's papers. Once, at a ceremony opening a public transit line that did not present itself as an obstacle course, a girl in a red coat barreled past the guard rope and into his knees. He steadied her without thinking, and only later recognized that this was newsworthy precisely because it would never make the news. He grew quieter. It suited him. Seraphine's reign took a new name. Not because she demanded it, but because language will not leave certain things alone. The era became known as the Living Empire. A phrase that sounded seditious in some mouths and necessary in others. She spoke less often and better. She did not stand for long receptions. No one dared to call it weakness when her cane clicked on marble. They called it tempo, and the orchestra adjusted. She went to fewer frontiers. Sent more engineers, insisted upon fewer statues and more benches. The treasury discovered that ramps cost less than monuments and paid out better in peace. On an evening like the one that had started all of this, lanterns breathing, night blossoms pulsing, the city beneath the balcony, humming like a patient instrument, the palace hosted a celebration. It refused to call a ball because balls make villains of chairs. The guest list read like a diagram of a new future. Mechanics and magistrates. Dancers with prosthetics that matched their ambition. Refugees from storms, who had learned how to teach civility to shelters. A chef who had built a ramp to his food truck with scrap and stubbornness. A boy whose hand-painted sign at last year's festival had read, "I want to go with you," and this year did not need to exist. Alira entered not as spectacle but as schedule. The sleeves along her thighs were different now, not heavier, not complicated, just cleverer at listening. The chair rolled, behind her as if happy to be a second choice. She had learned to decide when to lean on it, and when to let it lean on her. The orchestra, under the same conductor, lifted their bows with a softness that made the room belong to the first breath, not the downbeat. Arin waited at the edge, vest on because tradition without servility looks good on a person who refuses to be made a symbol. He bowed to the princess. A bow learned before history had tried to make him larger than he liked, and lifted his hand. "May I borrow what is ours?" he asked, splitting the pronouns the way a poet would and getting away with it because he was proposing work. She took his hand. The floor brightened, not to flatter, only to make note. They did not waltz as they had, though the old melody lay under the new one like bones under skin. They danced a sequence that had no name and did not require one. A promenade that became a turn, a step assisted and then not. A laugh turned into a flourish, an acknowledgement of weight offered back as praise. When Alira's legs began to argue with her, she sat without apology, and the chair lifted her with that little kindness. Everyone in the room had learned to envy. They continued, hand and wheel, hand and light, human and machine and intention, and the kind of patience that chooses to keep trying in public so someone more frightened can begin in private. Seraphine watched from the steps, leaning on her cane as if it were not a prop but a phrase. She felt again that treacherous, necessary, burning in her chest. She saw not a dynasty redeemed. That kind of language was a trap, but a world improving its manners. A child passed her carrying a flute too carefully, and she steadied the instrument's end with the crook of her cane until the player wrapped both hands around it again. If anyone saw, they pretended not to, which is the highest etiquette. The conductor lowered his arms. The room held silence, the way good glass holds water. Alira turned and offered her hand not to Irene, and not to the crowd, but to her mother. Seraphine did not hesitate, because hesitation becomes legend faster than kindness does. She descended the last 2 steps, felt the floor adjust under her weight, and placed her free hand in her daughter's palm. The grav chair rolled back, as if giving room to a reunion. Aaron moved aside without becoming the absence. That is a skill. Servants teach kings when kings are willing to be taught. They didn't perform. They occupied tempo. The Empress shifted her weight and let her body remember mornings not recorded in any book, rocking a baby through fevers, walking a man's last steps with him through a hospital wing splashed with sun, holding still for a portrait while her knee burned and refusing to show it. Alira kept the count with the calm authority of someone who has learned that leadership is a metronome, not a sword. They turned once, badly and bravely, and the room found the right way to watch, not with pity, not with awe, but with that steady, unsentimental admiration, reserved for craftspeople and survivors. When the music ended, no one rushed the dais for a speech. The speeches were in the doors that had opened quietly all week, in the way the old steward did not apologize for using his stool in public, in the way the High Consul had stopped rehearsing paragraphs and started asking questions he didn't mind getting wrong the first time. The applause arrived exactly on time and felt like agreeing to plant a tree in a courtyard you'll never live to sit in. Later, when the guests had gone and the lanterns had dimmed to the higher of their last hour, Seraphine, Alira, and Aaron walked the garden's loop. The night blossoms sighed their light into the leaves, and the city's roofs winked as if ships were signaling from a dark sea. At the small table under the arch, the wind-up toy with crooked legs sat where it always did. Aaron picked it up and wound it once, gentle. It lurched forward and laughed its tin laugh. Alira laughed back, richer and lower, the echo of a child's sound grown into a woman's right. Seraphine placed her palm on the grav chair's seam the way Aaron had taught her. "May I borrow your rhythm?" she asked her daughter, and then, after a brief, perfectly improper pause, "May I borrow yours?" she asked the human. Alira put her hand on her mother's. Aaron set his on the other side. The chair hummed, delighted to be a chorus. They stood there for a long minute, 3 pulses braided, and did nothing worthy of a newsfeed except existing without apology in the same square of air. The night loosened. The empire, which had learned to measure itself by how gently it could keep people alive while they did ordinary things, kept time with them. The last lantern went out. The garden did not get darker because the light that stayed was not the kind the palace paid for. It was the kind that begins in the palm, where 2 other hands are resting. The kind named and passed on in kitchens and workshops and corridors, where a sign says, "Knock," so the room can answer. the kind that does not end when the song does, because it has decided to be a way of walking.